Welcome to Doug's RV14 build.
In this episode, we'll be talking about building the fuel tanks, which will be an integral part of the wing. To prepare the ribs for the fuel tanks, you must complete a final drill of the holes in the flanges of the ribs. The ribs are then fluted to make sure that the flanges of the rib are perpendicular to the rib webs. And finally, all the holes are dimpled. The nose of the ribs are nicely rounded to fit into the skin. Prior to dimpling the skin, the areas where the ribs are attached to the skin are scuffed up. We peel back the protective covering and start dimpling the holes. Manually, one by one, dimpling the holes so the rivets sit flush so as to not create extra drag when flying. Once the dimpling of the skins are complete, we move on to taping rivets into the skin, getting ready for the stiffeners. Using a sealant called Pro Seal, we mix two parts together by weight and then make sure they're well mixed and load the sealant into the cartridge, and the cartridge goes into an applicator. The sealant is then applied to each stiffener, and each stiffener is put in place where the rivets are in the skin. The rivets are then squeezed using an impact to seal up the stiffener on the skin. The drain flange and fuel cap are also riveted and sealed in place. We then install the skin into the wooden cradles and begin applying the Pro Seal sealant to the ribs. The rib is then inserted in and clecoed in place, ready to be riveted. And Rosie the riveter is back to give me a hand to get this rib riveted in place. The sealant is then spread between the rib and the skin to make sure there are no gaps and that everything is well sealed. With all the inside ribs installed, we now prepare the outside rib with the sealant, cleco the rib to the skin, and then using the pneumatic squeezer, squeeze the rivets in place for the outside rib. And finally mix up another batch of sealant and go over the joint between the skin and the rib to make sure it's well sealed. Now we move on to the other end of the fuel tank, installing the outside rib, which also has a bracket which attaches the fuel tank to the fuselage of the plane. Cleco that in place while we're putting the sealant in, and then install the top half and connect the vent line to the inside of the rib. Moving on, we now make sure that the sealant is spread evenly between the end rib and the skin to make sure that there is no fuel that is going to leak from the inside of the fuel tank to the outside. Apply the clecos and then pneumatically squeeze the rivets, making sure that the rib is well secured to the skin. Fuel float sensor is installed. We now apply a bead of sealant along the top or the back of the outside ribs and the skin, getting ready to put the back plate on the fuel tank. With the back plate properly fitted and aligned, we then cleco the back plate onto the fuel tank, making sure that we get a nice tight fit between the skin, the ribs, and the back plate, ready to be riveted. The next step is to rivet the attach brackets, the Z brackets as they call them, to the fuel tank. These brackets are used to mount the fuel tank on the main spar of the wing. Pro Seal is applied between the Z brackets and the back plate to ensure a good seal. They're all clecoed in place, and then using blind rivets, rivet the Z brackets to the back plate and ribs of the fuel tank. With the riveting all complete, we then turn the fuel tank upside down to allow the sealant to sag down in between the back plate and the skin.